Hey, this is Noel Paul Stookey congratulating John Broughton on his 20th year on the air. 3SER KC Radio. You're a jewel.
But the fruit of the poor lemon is impossible to eat. Lemon tree, very pretty.
Back to your very early days, you were a stand-up comedian before you got seriously into music.
Well, I generally try to explain that in terms of, I'm definitely not a Billy Crystal or a Robin Williams, but I, like anybody who gets nervous in a social circumstance, I found ways to relax the people around me and myself as well. Quite often using sound effects. I was a big fan of Jonathan Winters, and from there I just went on to expand the premise. As a matter of fact, the first couple of albums that Peter and Mary and I made together, and certainly our stage performances, had folk tunes with sound effects embedded in them. If it were not Car Carp, and it was the Sloop John B., and there were a couple of others as well.
Do you recall your first meetings with Peter and with Mary?
Well, Mary I knew socially. I worked a couple of coffee houses in Greenwich Village, and Mary was a resident there, a new mother who had a long association with folk music. I didn't realize it at the time, but she had sung with Pete Seeger, and she was quite comfortable in all the haunts. All the owners of the clubs knew her. She had worked as a waitress prior to having a child at one of the coffee houses. Peter was the itinerant musician. He was handled by a very famous folk music manager at the time by the name of Albert Grossman, who later became our manager. And Peter was in town with Albert, who was a resident of New York, talking about forming a trio. And I think Albert had in mind a serious singer, a goofy singer, and a knock 'em dead blonde. And he put the three components together and then just stood back.
He certainly got it right, didn't he?
I think so. Yes, it was a very unique combination. The thing that surprises me is that now I hear, but you never know how much of it, John, is revisionist history. But now I hear that Albert always had in mind to build a trio of individuals, a group that would sing together but would retain their identity, their separate identities. Okay. And certainly, if any group did, it's us.
I believe there was a very long, extensive rehearsal period for the three of you before you began playing live.
Well, we had to find, we had never really sung in groups before. I had been leader of a rhythm and blues group in high school. Peter had sung or played for at least, perhaps he did some vocal assistance to a Israeli dance troupe, and Mary probably was one that had the most group singing experience. So we were just finding our blend at the same time we were learning the tunes. So we spent about 6 months, maybe even a little bit more, maybe 8 months, putting a package of songs together, which we would then take to our first performance, which was also in Greenwich Village at the bitter end.
Did you know right from the beginning of that rehearsal period the sound that you were aiming for, or did that more or less develop itself during that rehearsal period?
We weren't aiming for a sound, but certainly the resultant sound we were pleased with. But frankly, we were pleased with it before we went into rehearsal. We had a meeting, I'd say a full month before we started rehearsing at my apartment, where Mary introduced me to Peter because Peter had been at her apartment and they were working on something together, and they came over and we sang three different versions of Mary Had a Little Lamb, one with me doing the melody, one with Peter doing the melody, and one with Mary doing the melody, with the other two doing harmony parts. And it was quite evident at that moment that we had a blend.
I've spoken to many people that were part of that folk scene in Greenwich Village in the 60s. It sounds like it must have been just a magical place to be. Do you have any favourite memories there?
Just about every night was a favorite memory. Whether it was the card game upstairs with Dave Van Ronk and John Wynn and Bob Dylan and Len Chandler and Hal Waters and Oscar Lane, and I mean just a whole raft of really interesting itinerant musicians, or whether it was downstairs ad-libbing on each other's stage, you're doing harmony parts like a portable, spontaneous concert of the time, or whether it was our time off, quite often, which would be spent at other coffee houses listening to other performers. It was very much, I've called it jokingly, but perhaps with a seed of truth, Greenwich Village University, because it was very much like a series of classrooms. Each coffee house had a different course to offer, and you couldn't wait to get out of one class to go to your next one, or you couldn't wait to get to the next class. I mean, it was a real melting pot of talents and a real inspirational place to be.
It sounds like it had a real community feel to it as well, amongst the musicians.
It had that as well. As
Yeah.
a matter of fact, it was somewhat aligned on we-them, unfortunately. Towards the end of the time, we entertainers became very aware that because Greenwich Village was such a popular location, that the owners of the clubs were making a great deal of money, and they weren't really paying us legitimately. We were still passing baskets or, getting just a couple of meals and a couple of bucks to keep us on call. So they created a performers union just as Peter, Paul, and Mary went on the road. So we didn't have a lot to do with the success of it, but there was no questioning the fact that the people were coming down to see the entertainment, and that ultimately, the entertainers would have to be paid their full bore.
Now, of course, you mentioned Albert Grossman before, your manager. How do you rate his influence on your career and also on the folk scene in general at that time?
I think Albert was a very very talented, very tasteful, and man, and I think his impact was far-ranging. I mean, I wouldn't say that Albert was the Renaissance man, but looking back at his career, he seemed to balance it very well with being a restaurateur. He still has, there still is a restaurant in Bearsville, New York, that bears his imprint. He was the master of the deal on the come. Do you know what that means?
Got a general idea what you mean, but go on anyway.
Well, Albert really believed in people. Otherwise, he wouldn't represent them. If he thought that something had value, he wasn't the least surprised nor disappointed if other people didn't see the value, but actually quite often converted it into a tidy profit for himself, because he would go to the people who were, in this day and age, or in that day and age, as entertainment began to become more and more important, he would say, well, then don't pay me anything for the opportunity for these people to perform for you, and I'll just take all the gross, you'll take your costs out, and we'll take 80% of the profits. And the fellow, thinking that he had a real rube on his hands, would say to Albert, hey, you got yourself a deal. In fact, Albert was really more in touch with the public, I think, than a lot of people, and he knew that the place would be packed out. So Albert taught a lot of us a lot of things on many levels, but one of them was to really understand the value of what it is you have, and don't give it away cheaply. Even when we wanted to do benefits, and we still, to a certain extent, keep that up. Peter, Mary, and I still do a lot of benefits worldwide. And Albert was a great believer that you don't do it for free, because if you do, then people don't have anything invested in the moment. So even if it was a token, even if it was just $1, that kind of attention to detail and that kind of sensitivity to a audience's desires was quite unique at the time, and I think to a large extent it rubbed off on all of us.
Did you have any inkling or idea when you finished recording that first album that the commercial success that would follow? Because that kind of success was I guess, unprecedented for folk music at that time, wasn't it? The great chasm actually occurs between performance and recording.
we knew immediately when we were performing that for some reason or another there was something happening. There was a synergy on stage that the audience was much more aware of than we were. They loved what we did, and that was a great encouragement. But when you put that on a piece of vinyl or on a CD or on a cassette, you know you're going to lose the magic of the moment, or at least you're going to lose the electricity or the energy that happens in a live performance, and you wonder how that's going to translate over a tiny little 3-inch speaker in somebody's car. And so we didn't care actually about the records so much as we did about concerts, and to a large extent that's still true. We still do 40 concerts a year, but we don't release, I bet we've released maybe an album every 3 or 4 years, and quite often that's a retrospective album. But when the first single, Lemon Tree, began to get airplay in the San Francisco area, and we were, say 4th or 5th on the bill at the Hungry Eye there, we began to see the connection between the recorded image and the performing image, because we went from 4th on the bill to 1st on the bill, and the record went from obscurity to number 30, and the second single was If I Had a Hammer, that went to number 10, and that was almost immediate. I would say within a span of a year and a half from when we got together, we were top 10 folk music artists, and stayed there almost at our beck and call. I mean, whenever we would put out some piece of music, we got some serious attention paid to it, whether it was I Dig Rock and Roll Music, or at the end, ironically, the last year that we were together, we had our only and first number 1 single, Jet Plane, though many others had gone, top 10.
So it was never really a goal or anything that you set out to achieve to bring folk and protest music to the mainstream as you did?
No, definitely not. We were just part of the march, part of the people on the train. We had inherited this music from Woody and Pete Seeger and, Josh White, and we felt a responsibility. I think to a large extent the responsibility extended into our personal lives, because we felt that we had to be politically responsible as well. Certainly from the matter of integrity, we didn't want to sing about something that we didn't know about. So whether that meant a trip to El Salvador, or whether it meant, getting a briefing from the State Department on hunger, or whether it meant marching with Dr. King in Alabama, there's always been kind of a connection between real life and our music. And so to that extent, we never really focused on the end goal, never focused on goals so much as we just focused on being there.
At the Newport festivals of the 60s, any special memories there?
Well, not... sometimes when something important happens in your life, you tell the tale, and then a couple of weeks later you might tell the tale again, and then perhaps a month later or 2 years later you tell the tale again, and time has a way of diffusing the immediacy of the circumstance. And if I had to recall on my own the Newport festivals, I knew that they were exciting times, mostly because it was a large family of folk musicians. We all more or less believed in the same, political progressive agenda, but I couldn't give you, details or this visceral sense of excitement that perhaps I could have a week after the event. Mm-hmm. But I did see a movie recently, and you should as well, and the listeners might really enjoy it, called Festival.
Yes.
Which, for the first time, I was able to see from an audience point of view what was going on at Newport, and it was incredibly exciting, because this was not only new music done in a most accessible mode. When I say accessible, I mean as a listener, there was lots of room to invest yourself, either as a singer or a keeper of time. But there was also, the performance was less important than the message. And you become aware, as you see Festival, that there was a big message going on. People were taking people were filled with a sense that they could take control of their lives and make a positive contribution to making the world a better place.
I know exactly the film you're talking about. I do have a video copy of it, and there's some just magnificent footage there, isn't there?
Mm.
As a trio, you had a knack of finding the work of upcoming singer-songwriters, soon to be famous themselves. Was there a particular criteria you used when selecting those songs?
Well, it had to be something that the three of us could sing with our full hearts, because whether we were singing a harmony part or whether we were singing melody, we wanted to be able to mean what we sang. I think our access to new writers was aided considerably by the fact that Albert was a manager, and his management office was continuing to attract artists. We always had access to Ian and Sylvia and Odetta, but then Gordon Lightfoot came along, and though Albert didn't handle John Denver, our musical director was working with John Denver. So, and of course, the world of folk music, as I've tried to indicate, was very close, very chummy, and not competitive. The greatest, one of the greatest tributes you could make to another folkie was to sing his songs. So it was not a question of, stealing material. It was a question of, deference or recognition. And so and that community stayed alive for a long, long time, until I'd say, early 70s, when the recorded success became kind of the tail that wags the dog. And people would go into studios to record an album, and it became, their album rather than a collection of music that we all knew.
The lyric controversy to Puff the Magic Dragon, how serious did that get at the time?
Oh, I think it was somewhat damaging. I mean, it still is to a certain extent, because, it was totally fallacious. It was done as a piece of filler for Newsweek magazine. And then, unfortunately, somebody with very limited credibility, who happened to be Vice President of the United States, made a continuing comment, and I think to a large extent people are still under the impression that Puff the Magic Dragon has something to do with drugs, which of course it never did.
You had to pin it down to one particular thing. What do you think is the key to the chemistry between the three of you that's kept you together for so long?
Oh, boy. I don't know. How do you define magic? The interesting thing about the magic is that, about our particular magic, is that the components are not always the same. In the movies, when you see the witches standing in front of the cauldron and they go, and a pinch of sow's ear, and 3 shakes of a lamb's tail, and, well, that's a, how do you say, less than exact measure that they're putting in the pot. I think that, to a large extent, Peter, Mary, and I bring at different times, have brought, and will continue to bring at different times in our lives, value to the stage and to each other. Certainly we do it with respect, and, the guiding light of all of this stuff is love. I mean, there is no doubt about that love is the underpinning that holds much of our music together, gives us our focus, our vision, our mutual destiny, but it's also what we employ when we relate to one another as well. And if anything, I would say it's increasing in scope as we get older and wiser and cantankerous and slower to move and fatter of girth and leaner of hair. We are incredibly tolerant with each other, and but we still retain respect and regard our individual times away from each other and our individual talents as wonderful treats, wonderful adventures. When we return each year in April to see each other, we have 2 or 3 tunes that we've either written or we've discovered or quite apart from the other people. I think many relationships, frankly, not just musical relationships, but personal relationships, prosper a great deal from having spent some time away from each other. Because, after all, it is the individual with whom we fell in love, and to give them room to retain their individuality and or in some instances to rediscover it is a very great gift and a very important one to the relationship.
So it'd certainly be fair to say that the breaks that you have had over the years from the trio are probably breaks that you really needed to have to still be together today.
I think so. Both internally in terms of our personal searches and then career-wise, in terms of just Peter, Paul, and Mary having the breadth and the comfort to allow each other space.
When the trio disbanded for the first time, did you have any idea of the career direction that you wanted to take after that?
I wasn't really thinking about a career. My intention was to retire to the country, become a gentleman farmer, and get to know my family. I had 3 children. Well, actually, I had one child that I barely knew when the group retired in '69, but our twin daughters arrived in '71, and we moved to the coast of Maine in '73. Those were wonderful years for myself and our family. We got to know each other in a way that was not possible when Daddy traveled on the road all the time. And I think similarly, Peter and Mary had experiences in their own personal lives, though I think they were after a career rather than being a gentleman farmer. I think they had more of a desire to expand their musical experiences, and to a large extent, I think they were successful. Mary went to England, where she did a television variety show, and Peter, of course, produced several records, not the least of which was Mary McGregor's Torn Between Two Lovers, that went to #1. So they did have a life apart, but I was quite content. Matter of fact, when the phone call came in '78 to get together and make a record, and although I had always been up for making a record because I knew it would not mean, it was not the same as touring. Record had a finite schedule to it. You go into a studio, you work for 2 or 3 weeks, and then you're done. My wife had a sense that it was going to lead me back on the road again. Fortunately, the exciting aspect of what Peter and Mary and I have done these past 15 or 20 years is, actually it's 22 years now, this second half, is put a limit on the number of concerts. So we really, at the most, we've done, we'll do 40 shows in a year, and that makes it really quite manageable.
Yeah, it's a more comfortable way to conduct your touring career.
Mm.
What would you consider the trio's proudest achievement?
Oh, I have no way of knowing. That's I can think of some internal memories that between the 3 of us that were wonderful. Our visit to our tearful conclusion to a visit to El Salvador and Nicaragua, where we were just so moved by the courage of the people, and and certainly the Civil Rights March, certainly meeting Nelson Mandela in Japan and performing for him, the Queen of England, the special performances, the visits, the 14 visits to Japan that we've had, the acceptance that we've had globally, the fact that our material, some of our personal material, will live on years after we've stopped performing, is very gratifying. But it's not false humility. We are continually reminded that we inherited much of what it is that we brought to our music from folk greats, and if we made some contribution and can pass it on, then so much the better.
Now, I've asked this question to many blues performers in the past, and it certainly relates to folk as well. What do you think it is about the music form that enables it to transcend generations as it does?
Well, anybody can do folk music. I mean, if you've got a theme, a point, a concept, a cause, a purpose, a statement you want to make, just put it to a piece of melody, and you've got the beginnings of a folk tune. I mean, Louis Armstrong was, being humorous when he said, "Hey, everything's folk music, man. You never heard a horse sing, did you?" That was one of his famous lines. There's an element of truth in there. Most everything that's created by the human family is a candidate for folk music. But I think in the final analysis, it's what sustains itself without the reproduction of media. In other words, what songs are sung in churches, what songs are sung on marches, what songs are sung in living rooms, what songs are sung around campfires. I think those are the pieces of music that will linger on, and that is going to be the definition of folk music, and that is what makes it so accessible. It's immediacy and its relevance to the human condition.
Generally speaking, do you think audiences today still listen as intently to songs and lyrics of social and political importance as they did in the 60s?
Absolutely not. I do think it waxes and wanes, and I do think that we're moving into a listening period again, because I think technology is so overwhelming and the media and information glut is so heavy that in an effort to prune it down and to specify what it is precisely we want, I think we're going to go into, when I say we, I mean I think globally, listeners are going to begin to pick and choose the material they want, and they're going to spend time listening to its deeper value. But to a large extent, I think starting in 1969 and continuing until the mid-'80s, at least in America, songs of content were very rare. And we could see this even in the audience's occasional incapacity to follow a line of thought in a song. Story songs that took 4 or 5 verses were sometimes met with blank stares by people who had been discoed out. I mean, all they wanted to hear was "Hold me, baby, love me, baby, ooh-ah, 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 baby." Repeated over and over again to a very driving beat. And one wonders, philosophically, psychologically, if perhaps, at least in America, that wasn't a way of denying the very abrupt end to 3 of our very important political and social leaders here, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, and his brother and President Jack. By the time 1969 rolled around, the hidden message was pretty clear. If you ask not what your country could do for you, but in fact what you could do for your country, chances are you'd be dead. So, I think a lot of people just chose to work out the grief in a number of ways, one of which was to escape. But ultimately those things come around because the human condition does require us to attend to one another. I think that invitation is built into our system, and I don't mean political system. I mean just built into the human condition. And so we find now, as I'm sure you're finding in Australia, a wealth of new, independent, avant-garde writers, singers who really are connected with causes, whether they're environmental or whether they're social, and through the advent of the Internet now are able to express those views through their music to an immense audience and have their music downloaded. And perhaps they'll have a career, perhaps they won't, but you kind of get the feeling that that it's a commendable cheekiness that's going on, that they don't care about their career. What they really care about, as in the old days of folk music, is what the message is.
Which of the current breed of songwriters have really caught your attention?
Well, I work slowly, so I'm still, I still love Bruce Hornsby, so that's the way it is. I still love Sting's, Russian mothers love their daughter, their babies too, and I'm slow to come around to There May Be Giants or some of the newer groups, but I've and I don't know the names of a lot of the artists, but I do still turn on pop radio and hear Thank You India, and I am aware of Jewel, and I do hear Natalie Merchant, and there are artists, but I think more than the artists that I hear on the radio, it's the artists that I know of at probably the one largest still remaining folk festival of the United States called the Kerrville.
Oh, yeah.
Where the new artists get together and sing, and I know that from living on a campus now where my wife is chaplain, that among the high school age kids, independent music is very big and supportive, and not because these people are glamorous, but because of what these people are saying.
Now, away from music, let's talk about what you're up to these days. You've become quite involved in the world of computers and online communication. Can you tell us a little bit about your involvement there?
Well, I'm probably a comfortable. It's safe to say I'm comfortable, but I'm still pretty much a layman. Peter, Paul, and Mary have a website that I kind of oversee, and actually have, I have drug Peter and Mary into the 21st century by insisting that, this is the wave. I think it took them a while to figure out that I probably wasn't blowing my own horn, that in fact this was a wave. I've enjoyed communication, but nothing really changes. I mean, as much as things change, they remain the same. And so in the community of global networking, some of the same concerns and some of the same hopes and visions still surface as in your local neighborhood or the world around you before the internet. There are still people who need to be cautioned, people who need to be supported, and people who need to be loved. I remember as a systems operator of a small bulletin board where maybe 25 or 30 people would get together at one time for a chat, just using lowercase all the time. There was such a distinct difference between that and uppercase. I mean, one felt like you were speaking normally, and the other felt like you were shouting. Yeah. Those intricacies of custom, which the internet suggests, I think talk about a deeper thirst for intimacy and a desire to express it. I think the internet's going to be a wonderful place to be. I don't know if you are familiar with a book called Megatrends, but Robert Naisbitt, who wrote that book, suggested that there is a condition of the human heart that if it can't be filled one way, it's going to be filled another way. And if we cannot find the intimacy in the internet that we need to satisfy our souls, then we'll just drop the internet. It'll become, like a closet screen, and we'll go into the outer world to make deeper and richer relationships with people. So I'm not afraid of the internet. I think it's a nice adjunct to the creation.
You have yourself pretty well organised these days, coordinating your involvement with that and also your involvement in music?
Oh, I don't know. Everybody thinks they've got themselves organized from time to time, and then, a month later you'll talk to the same person and they'll throw their hands up in the air because they can't keep in touch with it all. They can't keep track of it all. I'm currently in a very, how shall we say, comfortable mode because this is when Peter and Mary and I take our 2 months off. We have, I don't know if you want to date the program, but I'm speaking to you in late January or middle January, and we have January and February's off. And in those times, we get a chance to catch up, get to explore new art forms, as it were, get to write our music. And so I'm quite relaxed, and to a large extent, I do have control of the life. But, when I go back to making a living again, then you'll probably see me with my hands up in the air saying, oh my God, I can't keep track of it all.
And just before we wind up, what's on the books for this year?
Well, Peter and Mary and I are going to go to Japan for, I think it's our 14th trip in March, and that will begin our touring for the year. We'll do a wonderful 4th of July celebration. I say wonderful because we've been there before in Tanglewood. which is in western Massachusetts, a very American date, the 4th of July, and we'll sing there. We'll do 40 concerts throughout the United States. Uniquely, and it's always a challenge, we'll be bringing folk music again to Las Vegas, which, the propensity is to put on a glitter suit or, for Mary to wear spangles and ostrich feathers and go strutting around the stage. But oddly enough, every once in a while, I think the powers that be in Vegas say, look, let's get some real family entertainment here. And oddly enough, they seem to be reaching in much the same way that Disney World or Disneyland has, for the family. So we'll go to Vegas in May for 3 days. We generally book about a year in advance, and I see nothing in the cards for Australia or New Zealand, though I certainly look forward to the next time we come.
Look, you've always been very welcome visitors here in the past, so we'll keep our fingers crossed you can squeeze us in there somewhere.
Oh, thanks.
Okay, Noel Paul, thanks for your time. It's been an absolute treat speaking with you. Some fabulous memories there. Thanks for the wonderful music.
You're a very patient man.
It's been a treat speaking to you. I'll let you get back to the internet.
Okay. I'll see you on the internet.
Yeah, sure will.
Let me know how it turns out.
I most certainly will.
Okay, John.
Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.
Yep, bye.